All right. Hello everyone. Welcome. Welcome to Women and Children First, the virtual edition. Well, we are here today to celebrate this incredible book, All Our Families by Jennifer Natalya Fink, Disability, Lineage, and the Future of Kinship. Jennifer is here today in conversation with Jessica Slice. And my name is Sarah Hallenbeck. I'm the co-owner of Women and Children First. We're one of the last feminist bookstores left standing in the United States. And I wanted to also offer an image description of myself. I'm a white woman with curly hair to my almost shoulders. Today I'm wearing a plaid flannel shirt, orange flannel. Behind me is a bookshelf with an array of books, because I'm actually in the back closet of Women and Children First right now, because we are open to the public, and so it's a little bit noisy out there, so I'm hiding in the back here. I also am a disabled woman. I have partial facial paralysis, which means that my eyes are always a little closed and my mouth is always a little open, among other things. And I also want to say thank you so much to Access Living, who is co-hosting this event. Today, Access Living is an incredible organization in downtown Chicago. I also want to thank our live captioner, Erin, who is offering captions today. Thank you, Erin, for doing that. And we begin our virtual events as we begin our events held here in the bookstore with a land acknowledgement. So please join me in acknowledging that the land on which our bookstore stands is the unceded territory of the Peoria, the Potawatomi, and the Miami people. There are over 75,000 Indigenous people living in Illinois, and we strive to recognize and honor Native literature and community. And we encourage you to learn more about land acknowledgements and the owners of the land where you're watching the event. And we urge you to ground the words of land acknowledgement in the work itself and find out what Native-led organizations are doing in your community. Here in Chicago, we want to uplift the work of the American Indian Center, which we partner with quite often. Women and Children First is now open for in-store browsing after being closed for quite some time. We also continue to offer curbside pickup, and we ship anywhere in the United States. Our events are still being mostly almost 100% virtual for a while longer, as we figure out how to transition to hybrid, which is our goal. A few notes: if you have questions for the authors, if you can put those in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, Jessica will read your questions to Jennifer later in the event. And I will be putting a link to buy the book and buy Jennifer's other books and Jessica's books as well in the chat. So please click those links to purchase the book. Okay, and I think we're on to the main event. Jennifer Natalya Fink is director of the program in disability studies and a professor of English at Georgetown. She is the author of 6 books and the founder of the Guerrilla Press. Fink is the winner of the Dana Award for the novel and the Catherine Doctorow Prize for Innovative Fiction, as well as a finalist for the Lambda Literary. First and foremost, though, she is a mother. The transformative experience of parenting her autistic daughter is the center of her work. Jessica Slice is a disabled essayist and author who has been published in Alice Wong's bestselling Disability, Visibility, with the New York Times, the Washington Post, Glamour, Cosmo, and HuffPost. She's been featured on Long Reads and on Judy Human's podcast. Her picture books about families with disabilities, This Is How We Play, will be released in 2023. I'm so excited about that. And the second book, This Is How We Talk, is forthcoming. Her undergraduate degree is from Davidson College and her master's in social work is from Columbia. I just want to say briefly that this book is incredible and it's such essential, necessary reading. It's challenging in all the right ways and necessary, and it's transformative on both a very personal, familial level, but also vibrates out to be transformative on a global scale. So thank you, Jennifer Natalya Fink. Please join me in welcoming Jennifer and Jessica to the virtual stage.
Oh, thank you so much for that introduction, Sarah. Really, really appreciate it. And thanks to all of you out there for coming this Sunday afternoon amidst war, COVID, Zoom fatigue, and all the rest. I'm Jennifer Natalya Fink. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I am a white middle-aged woman in a red velvet shirt with 3/4 sleeves with black curly hair in a bun and a gray background. Welcome. I'm so delighted to be here tonight to share all our families, disability lineage, and the future of kinship with you, and to be in conversation with a truly groundbreaking writer, Jessica Slice. I am coming to you live from unceded Piscataway Nacotchonk territory in glamorous Gaithersburg, Maryland. I encourage you out there to take a moment to Google whose territory you are on. All you do is throw in the old Google, whose territory am I on? And it'll tell you. Now, you can't unknow that, right? Now, personally, I kind of hate it when, let's say, some white lady in, let's just say, a bright red velvet shirt gets up and makes this kind of virtue signaling proclamation unless it's backed by action. So let's turn this statement of fact into a call to action, a call to restorative justice for Nacotchonk, Piscataway, and all BIPOC people. And I don't have all the answers, but I invite you to join me in that, lead me, collaborate with me in that work. One first step, if you go to nativegov.org, there's some interesting information there centered on Indigenous people about how to move from acknowledgement to action. If you're in my region and you want to learn more about the Piscataway tribe in the present, piscatawaytribe.org. And narf.org also has some great sources and resources. Now, a few quick thanks before I get started. First to Joanna Green, my editor at Beacon, as well as Priyanka Ray, Christian Coleman, Allison Rodriguez, and the whole Beacon team. I have to thank Amanda Annis, my amazing agent at Trident Media, who really helped me turn what was just like a glimmer of an idea, a hunch, into an actual book. And I want to thank Women and Children First, especially Sarah, Aaron, our captioner, and Access Living for their hard work making this event happen as accessibly as possible today. I first started going to Women and Children First, and you'll figure out my age when I tell you this, when I lived in Chicago in the late 80s, and when I had much more interesting hair than I do now. My hair has changed, but Women and Children First has remained a stalwart support of queer, women's, BIPOC, CRIP, and all of those writing from marginalized communities. And they've supported my work for the past 20 years. So really big ups for Women and Children First. And I hope you will buy all the things, the tote bags, the books, all the things from Women and Children First. My book, but other things too. Okay. And I want to thank all my families, especially my daughter, Nadia, the joy and center of my life, and Sarah Sohn, my partner in parenting and more. Thanks to Rona and cousin XY and Grandma Adina, who you'll hear all about in a second, and all our disabled kin. Zikrana Livroka. Let their memory be a blessing. Let their memory be a revolution. So I'm going to begin at the beginning and just read the opening gambit, if you will, which frames the problem I'm interested in this book, how delineating disability from family leads to trauma and ableism. And I'll also maybe read a little teeny bit more towards the end, which offers some, I am afraid to say the word solutions, but glimmers towards solutions to this problem. And you'll have to read the book to see how I get from that problem to the solution. And then Jessica and I will have a chat, and perhaps you can chat back. How does that sound? Shall we do it? Yay. I'm 7. I'm walking through room after room in my grandparents' cavernous Long Island house, looking for my cousin. Cousin, cousin, I call, wishing I knew his name. Cousin XY, I call. I know he's a boy, and I'm a geneticist's daughter, so chromosomes count. Cousin XY visits me in dreams. He has his father's eyes. My cousin XY was born in 1972 with Down syndrome and immediately abandoned. He was listed only as baby XY. I always knew my aunt and uncle had, quote, given away their son at birth. His very existence was explained to me as a tragedy, a crisis, an aberration that perhaps science could one day prevent. In the hospital on the day he was born, his mother refused to look at his face. Take him away, or so the story went. My grandfather, a family doctor, the family medical expert, was firm. Give him up. You can start over. You have a right to real children. He will be happier there. But where was there? I often wondered where my cousin was, who he was. Silence and other children quickly replaced him in the family narrative. On the rare occasions when his existence came up, everyone gave them away was repeated as gospel truth. And indeed, in the 1970s, institutionalization, abandonment, and excision from the family narrative was still too often the fate of those labeled incurable at birth. But I discovered that wasn't the whole truth. As with most families, the story of my family's disability lineage had far more strands than I realized. In 2017, when I was visiting a far-flung branch of my family in Manchester, UK, I discovered that there was another cousin in my family with Down syndrome, also on my father's side, buried in plain sight, Rona. Born in Scotland in 1946, 2 decades before cousin XY, Rona lived in apparent happiness. First with her nuclear family in Glasgow, and then in a group home called Cosgrove, which her mother helped found for disabled Jewish people. True to her name, Rona means joy in Hebrew. She lived a joyous Jewish life. 2 of my family members had been written out of the family story, delineated from our lineage. I mourned what I never had, both a lived relationship with my cousin and a family myth that could include them. I wondered how the knowledge of a rich, deep history of disability in my family would have changed my experience of my own daughter's diagnosis at age 2 as a disabled, non-speaking autistic person. If I had grown up playing with cousin XY, would we have experienced her disability as part of the warp and woof of our lineage instead of as a personal disaster rending us from the fabric of family? These were the questions that led me to think about disability lineage and what the implications of repressing, hiding, finding, and celebrating it might be for disabled people and their families everywhere. By cutting me off from knowledge of my disabled cousins, I had no source of disability knowledge and history in my family. Their lives were treated as extraordinary, disposable, and traumatic. So traumatic that the very fact of them was hidden, erased from the story our family told about itself. This is typical of how disability is narrated in the family myths passed down from one generation to another. Disability is erased, repressed, covered over. Families delineate, destroy the connections between generations of disabled people, their families, and their caregivers. Our disabled kin are not merely misrepresented, they are written out of the story. By examining the ways families excise disability from their stories, I began to see how disability is fundamentally shaped by this omission. The way we assign meanings to bodies and minds, establish norms, otherize and stigmatize according to perceptions of ability is inseparable from how we name and claim our kin. Family is defined and produced by eradicating disability lineage, often making the inevitable appearance of disability within a given family a crisis, a trauma to be erased, effaced, unwritten. I refer to this process as delineation, the separation of disabled people from their lineage. The word delineate literally means to mark off with lines and thus separate. It includes the word lineate, derived from lineage, family ancestry, right? The delineation I'm examining here is sometimes literal, as with cousin XY. It's sometimes rhetorical, as with the suppression of my cousin Rona and her disability from the family narrative. But delineate also means to describe or portray, right? I'm delineating my book for you right here, describing and portraying it, which is a form of inclusion. So within the word itself lies the potential, I think, to relineate, to sew a family member back into the fold, to describe, portray, and thus connect. And I'm going to jump forward quickly. To show a little bit about another way that this works, and then, the sort of possible ways we can redo, undo, relineate. And this one has a prop. So I'm not giving you the finger. I wear my grandmother's ring on my fourth finger. Here it is. It's an intricately carved, quirky little garnet, precious only to me. I'm married to my grandmother, I say to anyone who asks. It's a queer form of irony that marks my longest, deepest love, Adina Shalif Lewis, a tiny, eccentric leftist who adored me, Jewish folk dancing, and Adele Davis's health food regime, possibly in that order. Though she was a terrific student who tutored all the other kids, her father made her drop out of high school because she was a girl. Adina found a way out of poverty through a Jewish socialist community in New York, where she met and married my grandfather, Harold Hal Lewis, an educator and artist. Adina never worked outside the home, couldn't drive, and never wrote a check in her entire life. My grandfather managed everything, even by the standards of their generation's strictly defined gender roles. My grandparents were extreme. Yet they had one of the most loving partnerships I've ever witnessed. In their retirement home, the staff dubbed them the lovers because they were always holding hands or walking with the arm of my tall, still handsome grandfather wrapped around my tiny grandmother's fragile frame. And she was really small, if I'm saying so, because I'm like just barely 5 feet and she was up to here. Only after they passed did I consider the way disability shaped this incredible partnership. Adina Shalif Lewis was deaf. She hated her hearing aids and couldn't really lip read. She was hard of hearing from birth. I'm not sure exactly when she became, officially deaf. My grandmother spoke of disability only with disgust. She saw disabled children as disposable tragedies. I can see the face she made when disability was mentioned. Tragic, but also disgusting. Was that how she felt about her own hearing impairment? Grandma Adina spoke in a near shout in a heavily Yiddish-inflected Brooklynese. When she'd call my sister at college, her roommate would be like, "Your grandmother from Russia is calling." She couldn't even understand it as English. Fearful of the outside world, she was seemingly content to be a balabusta, a super housewife with left-wing leanings, who insisted that feminism meant the right to stay home. We had many arguments about this. Completely cut off from any notion of disability as a positive identity or a culture. Adina Shalif Lewis was the most ebullient, loving presence in my life. She found everything I did worthy of celebration and made light of any annoying character traits I revealed. I also talk about my mother, who became hearing impaired in her 60s, and how she handles it completely differently. She loves the hearing aids and, wants full access by any means necessary. Yet only as I was finishing writing this book did I think of including two of the people closest to me, the women who formed me, who loved me, one whose ring I wear on my finger, and the other whose smile I wear on my face. It's my mother's smile you're seeing. Didn't consider them part of my disability lineage. Shame and stigma about disability are so great that I had internalized them, unconsciously refusing to acknowledge that my very own mother and grandmother were disabled. For I would have had to confront another facet of my ableism, my own fear of deafness. So in developing a disability lineage, we not only uncover lost, hidden, disappeared family members who were institutionalized, abandoned, murdered in some cases, or otherwise cut off from the family tree, we may also discover that the family members who we never thought of as disabled, who perhaps never thought of themselves as such, were and are disabled. By valuing the diversity of body minds amongst our kin, we rediscovered the disability lineage right in front of our eyes, their deaf ears listening intently right across the dinner table from us. We also confront their erasure, how marginalized or otherwise mistreated they were because of their disabilities. It's not that disability lineage is always hidden away. It was right there in front of us, but shame and stigma kept us from seeing it as our inheritance. And then what to do about all this? I'm just gonna read one more small bit. Very grandiose, very grandiosely subtitled "Rending and Mending the Fabric of the Universe." Somehow it's easier to write that than to say that. Like I feel a little sick. I'm gonna rend and mend the fabric of the universe. Yes. Okay. Though we planned for 2 years, COVID-19 made us turn my daughter Nadia's bat mitzvah into a gil mitzvah, a sort of preamble to the main event. Nadia prepared Torah commentary. I prepared to cry. We chose her dress together. We went online to Bloomingdale's, Grandma Adina's favorite store, and I'm outing my bouginess here. She adored the discounts and the unsweetened soft serve yogurt. Even Adele Davis would have approved. Nadia adored all the dresses. I can't choose, she typed. Pick 2, I suggested. She chose 3. We ordered and hoped for the best. The purple plaid one with the unlikely metallic pink accents she finally chose to wear was gorgeously blingy and fit perfectly. Grandma Adina loved such unlikely color combinations. The gil mitzvah was more moving than I imagined anything on Zoom could ever be. Nadia's words, Nadia's prayers, Nadia's thoughts, Nadia's passion for Torah, for questions of God and speech and silence. Only when I was looking at the haphazard iPhone pics I took of us afterwards did I notice how Nadia's woven plaid echoed Rona's taffeta. Same pattern, same confidence. The term lineage itself gestures towards this expanded sense of belonging, meaning a collective as well as an individual ancestry. This double sense of heritage is precisely where disability lineage and ancestry meet, where our personal family histories and personages join with a larger ancestral memory. I pray to my deaf grandmother and remember all our disabled grandmothers. In imagining a future in which I will certainly be disabled if I'm so lucky as to be alive, I have my deaf grandmother to guide me. Grandma Adina can show me how to live joyously with a disability that she herself disowned during her life. I have Rona now reclaimed in all her sass to help me better understand and care for my daughter. And I have cousin XY, whose absence still haunts me, but whom I feel more deeply connected with after this deep dive into our disability lineage. In my dreams, he plays cards with me in my grandfather's basement. Thank you.
Jennifer, thank you so much. I have read your book now a couple times and have sat in another event, but I still love hearing all of that. And I'm so thankful that your book exists. I'm Jessica. I am a white woman with glasses and long brown hair. I am in a room, and you can see sort of a stained glass window with a setting sun. And I'm in a black and white chair, like I said, and there's a vintage picture of a lake behind me, and a green vase of some lavender beside me, and a gold lamp. I am disabled I have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and POTS. I use a wheelchair when out of the house, and when in the house, I need to be reclining and have my head supported. And I'm actually the mother of a disabled 5-year-old. He is autistic, and my husband is also autistic. And listening to you talk about your family and your lineage, it makes me think about just all the shoulders I rest on as a disabled woman, and the way my family is able to feel pride in the way our bodies and minds work. You know, we talk about disability really openly in our household, and really lightly. Today, I was trying to get Khalil to put away a board game, and he said, "No, I have a disability." And like, his disability certainly does not impact his ability to clean up the board game.
Smart kid.
He also recently said his disability is that he loves our dog too much. Still like wrapping his head around what it means to be autistic. And I just love that disability in our house is something that we can like play with and talk about openly, and work on understanding each other and our needs. And it makes me really thankful for all of the work that of activists that have come before me that allow me to feel pride in the way my body works. I had 2 questions that I personally wanted to ask you, so I'm really thankful for a platform to do it. The first is around the issues of selective abortion and CRISPR. You know, I identify as pro-choice and a feminist, and I also feel a real like visceral and like true discomfort with the idea of editing out genes that would make a person like me. And I feel really uncomfortable with the idea of women being pressured to terminate a pregnancy when a child would live a life like mine. And my response to that feels really, really visceral, like I said, and I hope to be brave enough to write about it soon, but it's tricky. It's a mess of a topic. Because there's like ethics and there's the philosophy around it, but there's also the real world we live in with inadequate funding for disabled people and inadequate supports. And anyway, all of that to say is I'd love to hear how you took on these topics, how you decided to like really engage with it, and how you worked with these 2 identities that I assume you have, you know, that I know you have, so disability justice activist and a pro-choice feminist.
Yeah, you know, thank you, Jessica, for first of all so beautifully describing your family and their experience, their lived experiences. And you just sound like, I love the lightness that you talk about, the joking. Yeah, we have that in our household too with my daughter. I think the other, I definitely am, you know, a disability justice activist and a pro-choice feminist, like you. I'm also the daughter of a geneticist, which even makes this even more complicated. So I think I used this narrative about my family and my cousin and second cousin once removed with Down syndrome to kind of unravel, re-ravel how we think about this stuff. How did we come to kind of using Down syndrome in particular, because the genetic mechanism is known as this sort of ableist rhetorical and actual practice in the world of genocide, where women really are, and I was one of them, pressured to have the testing, which I didn't want, and I talk about that. And then with CRISPR, this is sort of the same issues on steroids. So instead of going like pro or con, I guess what I did was sort of unravel the history of genocide against disabled people and how that's been wound around genetic testing, how that you really can't separate these two histories. So that was important to do, and that's really the scholarship of other people, but thinking through sort of my lived experience and the current conversations around this through that lens. And then really ending up saying that I'm not against these as tools. It's how tools and choices happen in a context. And what I think we need to focus on is who is making the decisions about these technologies? What voices are being heard? What voices aren't being heard? To get out of sort of against and for it, and instead, what would it mean to have disabled scientists centered in this research? What would it mean to have people like you and Rosemary Garland Thompson at the center of the conversations, not as the objects being discussed, right? But at the center of the conversations as scientists and citizens. I think that changes the conversation significantly. So choice is inadequate in thinking about context. We make choices in context, and I think the context has been profoundly genocidal and ableist. So that's one piece of it. And then, I think when you look at Down syndrome, the outcomes for people with Down syndrome have changed so profoundly due to deinstitutionalization and social integration and supports and education that and it happens at the very biological level of things like lifespan and health. The average person with Down syndrome only lived until their 20s during the age of institutionalization, as recently as the 1970s and early 80s. And now they live close to about 20 years less than people without Down syndrome. So they live into their sixth average, 60s, 70s, right? So, and the quality of life, they go to college, people with Down syndrome work, they do all they marry, right? So, and here's the interesting thing about this to me, there is not one new treatment for Down syndrome. This is not because of a medical intervention. It's entirely social. Has changed the physical experience of having Down syndrome, how long you live, how healthy you are you able to work, are you able to be educated? So that part of the story needs to be told, right? By objective measures, there's been this transformation. So thinking of that, I think, what would it mean for that to be at the center of how we think of things like genetic testing and abortion, and getting it out of sort of the left, the ping pong match that it's in, right? Really looking at choices in context, choices about how we use, what technology we develop and to what ends. What are we using this technology for? I would still defend the right, personally, I would still defend at the end of the day, the right of someone to make a decision that I wouldn't make, right? That's how democracies work, I think. But that's where I ended up really wanting to center disabled people in these conversations as scientists, right? And really examine that context in its fullness. And really confront the medical establishment with its own eugenicist history.
Yeah, I mean, I really love that you're centering disabled people as scientists and not only, like you were saying, the object, because we end up having to defend the value of our own lives when we're only the object. You know, saying things like, yes, I am in constant pain, but it's hard to believe, but that is still a worthwhile life, but there is still joy and meaning. And I think centering us as the experts, you know, because there's one of my favorite philosophers and friends who's a disability scholar, Elizabeth Barnes, says there is no view from nowhere. And people say disabled people have a biased view on these issues, but everyone has a biased
everyone view. Like where is this view from nowhere, right?
You know, we're all living in a body and with minds, and trying to make determinations about the value of a life is coming from your own experience of life. And so you're right, the experts also need to be disabled.
Yeah, I think that's fundamental. And then looking, you know, I knew this one story about my cousin, and then I uncovered this other cousin who had, you know, almost the opposite experience, was fully integrated into their family. And when they needed to live not with the family, the parents the mother created a whole institution that, you know, was considered cutting edge and humane and allowed her to pursue her Jewish faith. So, you know, having even those two examples showed that like the outcomes look very, very different depending on the social integration. And, you know, I was brought up by, you know, second generation immigrant parents and there was really this pressure to assimilate and to conform to, you know, white, suburban, upper middle class ideas. I was talking to a friend of mine, and he was saying, he was from a Black working class family, and he was saying, yeah, we had people with Down syndrome. I had cousins with Down syndrome. They babysat me. Like, the idea that you would, that was just not a thing in a Black community. He's about the same age as I am. And that really, you know, moved me that it's part of our sort of this white ableist middle class set of ideas about capitalist ideas about family that do this kind of delineation, and that's not the norm in other communities. So that's another sort of angle on it. But yeah, I think really centering the people who are going to be impacted the most as scientists and as the public voices, you know, that's who I listen to, and seeing how much access and inclusion. I'm you know, some people don't like the word inclusion. I think both are important. And context matter in what the outcomes of a given life is. And understanding, like, I don't know, this idea that we can guarantee if you have this number of chromosomes, like a happy life, like, really? Are you kidding me? It just seems like a very strange idea about humans, that their perceived differences around bodies and minds and disability, you know, lead to happiness, which is a complicated and abstract idea. That whole equation, I think, needs to be rethought radically. Like, what, and I think disability justice thinkers, scholars, activists, writers are helping me do that more ethically.
Well, that actually leads to my next question. I noticed in the book how seriously you took centering the voices of disability scholars and disability activists. And at the beginning, you really talk about that you know, from your position as a temporarily non-disabled person, you are, you know, that writing this book is complicated because you're writing a book about disability as a temporary non-disabled person. And knowing you and knowing your writing, I know that's not a decision you made lightly. You certainly didn't just assume that you were like entitled to take on this topic. I would guess you really wrestled with it. And I would love to hear both how you made that decision and then also how you, and I have some idea of the second part, but how you handled your process so that you were being a true like ally in disability justice, and how you were making sure that the voices that you centered weren't abled or temporarily abled.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a great, rich, complex question. And I just want to say I probably didn't do it perfectly. I probably have made some mistakes, and am eager to stand corrected, to open up this conversation to other voices, particularly those of people with disabilities, especially parents, like Jessica. So, one thing that I decided to do that helped was to cite blogs, to not just cite academic literature, which even when disabled people are in it, they're in positions of privilege, they're mostly white, et cetera, they have certain kinds of disabilities, not others. So I looked on blogs, I looked sort of in spaces where disability justice conversations are happening, as opposed to academic spaces or even books, and cited those alongside, some theorist, both because often the language was more accessible, but it came from embodied and minded experience. And so that was one way. And I think, I didn't want to waste too much time in the book sort of like apologizing for like, you're either going to do this or you're not. And I note my own positionality and its limitations. But I felt like nobody is talking about disability lineage and its impact. I also feel like parenting a child with there's a complicated thing where often parents, especially my daughter, is non-speaking. She's not nonverbal. She's extremely verbal. She has a lot to say, but she uses a letterboard to say it. There's a terrible history of parents speaking for disabled children, especially non-speaking. So I definitely didn't want to do that and was mindful of that. But I did feel like as a family, we have a particular experience that is worth sharing. And I also did feel like there's some things in this, like everything doesn't transfer from queer to disabled, but a lot does, is my feeling. I'm queer. I came out, when I was 18 in the early 80s, and the structural homophobia was just like unimaginable. And so there's pushback now, there's all kinds of stuff. There's transphobia, but I couldn't be out and get an apartment here in Chicago by law, for example. I almost got fired from my job at DePaul. Like this was completely different level of marginalization, and the discourse around not just people with HIV, but all gay people in the wake of the AIDS crisis was incredibly genocidal, actually. And even I was thinking today, I was reading something by a cishet white woman who doesn't have children, about how much she hates, being pressured to have children, and, blah, blah, blah. I was like, oh, nobody was pressuring me, sweetie. Trust me. Right. So not everything transfers, but some things do from being queer. Including the sense of people writing for you and not getting it. So I don't, I'm a little rambling because there's not like this formula for the right way to do it. And I think that's maybe the most important thing, is to try to center disabled voices whenever possible as who I cite and where I situate the conversation. I am in dialogue with disabled adults, both who share my daughter's disability and have other disabilities, and to be like a little humble in it, I guess, that, I'm not going to get everything right, and to see it, frame it a little bit as like, I want to start this conversation that other people may critique or take in other directions. So that's kind of where I ended up with it.
I had muted myself. Yeah, that answers my question. And it is, I mean, it's what I picked up on in the book, is there's this sense of humility that you do have something to say, but if someone were to say like, hey, I think you, a disabled person particularly were to say, hey, I think you missed this, I truly feel like you would say, yes, tell me more. I'm really open to that message. And that the point isn't for you to prove that your thoughts are flawless, even though like the intellectual rigor of the book is there. But it's not a drive to prove that intellectual rigor.
Yeah, and I think, I got a PhD and I was totally burnt out on that thinking. So I did, for almost 20 years, I didn't write anything more critical. I just did creative work. And Eve Sedgwick wrote this piece that everyone cites, and I'm one more person citing this piece about paranoid versus reparative rhetoric. But I really did try to make it not this sort of like, I'm going to prove this point over and over again, but instead sort of look at this as like repair. Like that's what I'm trying to do, which is a more open questioning process than I have this point and I'm going to prove it. And I have like that paranoid argumentation style. Like I really grew up with that and perfected it in my PhD. So it's sort of a relief to not have to be right. I don't know how to say this, but like there's a part of me that's just incredibly relieved to say, this is contingent and partial, and I'm getting a lot of things wrong. And, even some of the language I had, hearing impaired instead of hard of hearing, and I changed it like the 11th hour, and I think I missed one, so I'm sure I got a lot of things wrong, or that it's just my partial vision, right? But I did feel like it was a conversation that wasn't happening, that could be helpful and open something up, particularly for disabled people, particularly for disabled parents, I think. I mean, that's probably the group of people I'm most interested in hearing from is you, Jessica. Represent all disabled parents
on behalf of us. Well,
yeah.
I'm actually going to take just a quick break, but Sarah's going to hop on and field any questions that come in, and then I'll be right back.
Great.
Sounds good. Awesome. Thank you. It doesn't look like we have any questions from the audience yet, but I would be happy to ask my own, and maybe and encourage anyone tuning in, if you do have a question for Jennifer, please put it in the Q&A or the chat, and I will read it to her. Yeah, so I am interested in ways or strategies that you kind of like what Jessica was talking about earlier, in terms of using humor and just a kind of like straightforwardness to talk within her family about disability beyond humor. And like, how, as a disabled mom myself, do you have any ideas? Because I think, I was raised in a home that kind of, in a way, thought that empowerment was erasure of my disability, and that was that I'm, so I have internalized that quite a bit and still am unlearning that. So if you could talk about that unlearning, how to begin that unlearning process, especially for parents, how to transfer that unlearning to your child now that,
Yeah, you said that so eloquently, that in some way they thought they were helping you or through erasure. And I think that's my family and many families, not Jessica's, but
yeah.
right. And I think, one piece that you know, when my daughter was diagnosed, I got all kinds of advice from all kinds of doctors, therapists, you know, put her in 50 hours of ABA, do all these crazy things. It was like this trauma panic. You've got to do things. Nobody said, find your people, find other families. Nothing normalizes something than a community. And I am a pretty introverted, nerdy person, in case you can't tell. Right? That is not my strength in life, is not community building. It's really not. Anyone who works with me will tell you. So my partner is more like that. And I stretch, which is, I think, something that we're talking about, you know, how do you, we've come from these families that sort of encourage us to assimilate and sort of silence around disability as a way of helping, right?
Empowerment, yeah. Empowerment.
Empowerment. And I think, like, for me, being with my kid, yesterday was a good example. Her best friend had her 15th birthday party. They're a few weeks apart in age. And that's a family that I think we first did the 9th birthday together. So we've been doing this. We see, before COVID, we saw them almost every weekend. And they had hired an outdoor patio, right? That was a public space, but it was our space, right? And my daughter could be herself fully in STEM and do what she needed to do. Not hidden away, we're in public, but with her friends and families. I honestly think that seems to do more than anything I do rhetorically about normalizing, is just being with other kids who share her disability and their families, both in private and in public, right? Sort of normalizes and celebrates in some way, you know. So that is one thing I think, is like finding your people. Nobody said that when my daughter was diagnosed. They said, you need ABA, you need this, you need that, you need therapy, mom, you know, all these things. Nobody said what you need is to find a community that values your daughter, and like where she sees herself mirrored and sees your family mirrored. And that's kind of a normalization without eradicate, you know, without hiding anything.
Right.
So I think that's a big step.
Yeah, that makes so much sense to me, because I think in growing up, like the experience of growing up for most, I think many disabled folks, is having to like split yourself between your home self, where your disability doesn't feel like an impediment, like a barrier, and then your outside self, where it is all anyone sees. So to try and what I hear from you is like being in public, you know, merging those things, not separating those.
Yeah, and I talk a lot in the book about like being disabled in public and how that's part of the threat of it, the internal to the family, is this like fear of. So I think being disabled in public collectively, like with disabled people, really kind of changes that. And then just, you know, the disability lineage piece, I think does, you know, I've talked to my daughter a lot about her grandmother and her cousins, and that, you know, that this is, you know, there were people before you. I think that is a piece of it.
Yeah, for sure.
It looks like a Q&A did come in. It says, for Jennifer and Jessica, in what ways do you cultivate joy in the face of an ableist world? I mean, Jennifer, do you mind if I answer that?
Yeah, no, go for it.
I think it's something that I'm really proud about in our little family. And I get the impression yours is similar, is that we laugh so much that we really do have a very happy and kind home. And I feel like really proud that we have that we've cultivated that, and that we've allowed each other to be who We are. And I think I haven't thought as much about why, but I think some of it is that we're all very open about our bodies and our minds' needs. We speak about them at home without shame. You know, and we also, and like we were saying, we joke about it. Like sometimes, you know, and like I'll have a like pretty serious need and it will interact pretty badly with my husband's serious need. And we joke about this perfect storm of like disabilities crashing together. But then I don't know, but we laugh about it because the needs itself, like we just don't, we allow each other to have needs without shame. And I think that gives space for joking and for joy and for laughter. And I would think if you were to watch, you know, to know our identities, you might think, well, that is like probably an arduous home to be in. And it truly is not. It truly is a happy home to be in.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. And I think part of the disconnect for me was I've always found my daughter to be like a fun and joyful person, and there are challenges. Yes. She might bust in here with no clothes on any moment, hence the blurred background. So I don't want to minimize challenges, and you know, but I always found her so joyful and fun to hang out with. I like being with her. And that was part of the disconnect with the narrative that I got when she was diagnosed, was that this was tragic and horrible and all these things, this thing to be overcome and then when she couldn't speak, oh my God, is she even a person? Blah, blah, blah. And I felt this disconnect, like there was her and being with her, and then there's this story about her. So I think rejecting that story in some way is a big piece of it. And that part of it for us was actually knowing autistic adults, non-speaking autistic adults, right? And seeing like, oh, their lives are fine. They have challenges, but like they're happy people who are, you know. So, and then I think there is just sort of an everyday fun joy, you know, we have good days and bad days and things can vary wildly, but like the particularity of who she is and how she is very joyful and sweet and fun and funny. Like there's a lightness in that, and that can be happening with heavy things, with medical, you know, like I don't like to sort of, she can share what she wants to share about her body mind. She's 15, but you know, we have some challenges. Even on like the worst day, there's still the possibility of joy and fun and play, you know, with her. So, and like, since when am I just like this delightful person? Have you met a neurotypical person? Like, I'm not sure I'm any more, you know, like a great catch in some way, like this idea that people, that's part of what pisses me off about this whole weird ableist rhetoric about like the normal child. Do you know any children? Like they're all assholes, they're all off, like they're children, and they're all possibly joyful and wonderful too, you know, like so it sort of, I'm not always joyful. I'm not always fun. I have moods. I'm a person. I'm a complex person, and she's a complex person. And yeah, we really do have fun together. And I guess also, I think there's a lot of similarities between us. I talk about this in the book, this idea. That's why I hate that whole far from the tree bullshit. No, thanks. Like, she's my daughter. We have a million weird, quirky things in common, right? As much as any parent and child. So yeah, in some way, I think it's reconciling the lived joy with this ableist narrative that dogs us wherever we go. I mean, that's the hard part for me, honestly. It's not really finding the joy. It's that other piece.
I love that. I think that's a wonderful way to end this event. That is such, like, you just said that so beautifully, like, and like rejecting the narrative. I like that. thank you everyone who joined us today for this virtual conversation. The conversation today was recorded, and I will be uploading that to our YouTube channel, which you can find at womenandchildrenfirst.com. So if you know anyone who couldn't join us today, don't worry, it's still available. If you haven't purchased All Our Families yet, there's a link in the chat, as well as a link to Disability Visibility, which Jessica Slice has an incredible essay in. So please buy both of those books and all the books. Support your local feminist bookstore here in Chicago, or if you have a feminist bookstore in your community, support them too, please. Thank you, Jennifer Natalya Fink. Thank you, Jessica Slice. That was such it's the conversation that I needed right now.
Thank you so much, both of you.
Sarah, I feel so fortunate to have met you. Thank you.
Good. Come to Chicago, come say hi.
Sacred bookstore.
Thank you. Have a wonderful night. Bye.